Hello, and welcome from Pittsburgh Shakespeare in the Parks to our Week of Will events. My name is Alan Irvin. I'm one of the board members, resident storyteller, and actually my pleasure to be kind of the host for this evening's program where we are kind of going behind the scenes in theater in general and PSIP in particular. And so we are talking this evening with Tonya Lynn, who is PSIP's resident fight choreographer. And well, that's probably a good place to start, Tonya.
Sure.
What exactly is a fight choreographer?
Yeah, it's one of those kind of behind the scenes jobs that sounds really mysterious unless you've had the chance to peek behind the curtain and see what goes on with it. So it is a choreography role, just like a dance choreographer. So I'm in when I work as a fight choreographer or as a fight director, it's my job to plan out the movements of the fight scenes in a way that is repeatable and safe for the actors and for the audience and tells the story that is required by the script that we're working with and also supports the character arcs and the director's vision and the actors interpretations of their characters. So it's a really collaborative part of the design team that is a lot more hands-on with the performers than a lot of some of the other design collaborators can sometimes be.
So when you say a fight scene, what is that like big battles and swords or I mean what's the range here?
Uh, ev- I've worked on everything from a simple grab, slap, shove in single or in combination of all three to mass battles with swords and shields and random found environmental bits of props and scenery that characters might choose to fight with. Um, Food fights, pillow fights, champagne bottle fights, pretty much anything that someone might pick up and decide as a character choice to aggressively use that object against another person in the scene. Somehow it probably makes its way into fight choreography at some point.
So basically any sort of aggressive physical action.
And it's a lot of times this is stuff that is already put into the script when we're working with Shakespeare. The most open stage direction that there is those two words "they fight" in parentheses. That's one of my favorite T-shirts that I have says "they fight." That's my cue. um, uh, so they sometimes it's put in the script in very vague terms like that. Sometimes uh, in the dialogue, it really describes what's going on between the characters. When one character says to another, "Let me go," obviously they're being restrained or prevented from leaving in some way. So that informs what the choreography needs to be to tell the story. And as you get forward into, more contemporary playwrights, Tennessee Williams loves to write pages and pages of stage directions that describe in detail the action that the playwright wants to have happen during a scene.
So it sounds like you have to work with the director and kind of figuring out what's going on in a scene or a fight.
Absolutely. I do plenty of my own script reading and historical research and dramaturgy that I'll bring to a design meeting, but I also have to listen and support and be flexible around a director's concept for a show, especially when we're working with Shakespeare. We might have a director who's doing a very historically inspired take on the play, and you might have a version that is going to put the play in a different time and location entirely. And that's going to change what the violence looks like. You know, weapons in ancient Rome are way different than the way people fight in, American vaudeville comedy.
So it sounds like then it's also influenced by the costume design and the look and things like that. So
Yep, absolutely. It's lovely when I know what the costume design is well enough in advance and we have pieces that we can work with and I can collaborate with a costume designer, because in real life, people use what's available to hand. And one of the things that's available to hand is what people are wearing. So when we can incorporate that into the story of the scene, it starts to become a lot more organic and a part of the world of the play, rather than this moment that's layered on top of everything that's already happening in the play and the rest of the scene. Um, as a fight choreographer, it is my hope that my contribution to the work seamlessly fits in with everything else that's going on, and it seems like it belongs in the story at the point that it happens.
So then you'd also have to work with the actors. So do they typically come in knowing how to do some of this, or do you have to teach, or?
Usually it's some kind of combination of both. Stage combat training is something that is not universally a part of every actor's training. Depends on where they are in their career. Maybe they're just getting started and they haven't had a chance to train in it yet, or maybe their training program didn't have access to it. Or maybe they devoted a lot of time and energy to studying it, and I may have a wide spectrum of experience within any given cast. And so one of my colleagues describes this as being a little bit like the Iron Chef. And you walk into the kitchen and you see the ingredients that are there and you figure out how to make something delicious with what's in front of you. Um, no matter what their level of training in stage combat is, every actor has a lifetime of experience living and moving in their body, so they know how their body moves, and that's the thing that they can bring to the choreography as well. And so I'm always working with the actors where they are, and if there's a particular technique that we need for this scene to make it work, or a particular skill set, maybe we're looking at some rapier and dagger fencing in a play. We'll do some training with the actors to make sure that we have the tools that we need to do the choreography that the scene demands. Um, but we're always going to be looking for solutions that look natural and motivated by the actors that are the ones that are performing the scene.
So do you have a favorite type of weapon or type of fights that you like to do?
This is like every time I talk about being a fight choreographer, this is a question that always comes up, and it's always one of the hardest ones to answer. So I've come up with my cheap cop out answer, and it's what weapon style am I working on at the time? That's my favorite one, because I'm getting to do my favorite style. I do have some, every weapon style that I have found myself working in, to expand on what we mean by weapon styles. Uh, Speaking from my perspective of working in the Society of American Fight Directors, with whom I'm a certified teacher, the SAFD does training in 8 styles of weapon. So they're very broad umbrellas of weapon types that we have kind of a vocabulary of techniques that we use to create choreography around, that are based on historically how these weapons have been used and adapted for safety on stage. So unarmed is a style, knife is a style, rapier and dagger is a style, broadsword or longsword is a style. small sword, which is a think the time of the American Revolution, Restoration era England, uh, fancy wigs, fancy jackets, very elegant swords. Historically, that's a small sword or a transitional rapier. Um, that's a style. Quarterstaff is a style. So we have all these different styles, and there are things about each of these weapons that I love. Single sword, which is like Hollywood swashbuckling, is a favorite style of mine because there's so much in that. It's a weapon that's kind of a chameleon weapon. It can behave like just about any other sword throughout history because Hollywood has deemed it so. And because of that, it's a great weapon for comedy in combat, which is something that comes up more often than you might think. And it is a lot of fun to be able to find those moments of physical comedy in the middle of conflict. And it's nice moments for the audience to breathe, laugh, and relax.
So is there any particular sort of challenges or situations that you hit that you just remember back, either, well, that was fun, particularly fun, or, oh, that was a particular trial, or
um, one, I've done a couple of productions of Three Musketeers, both of which have their own measure of trial, because those are scripts that deal with that plot are very much trial by fire for a fight director. There are so many fights, and keeping them distinct from each other so that they each have their own uniqueness, not just for storytelling, but so that the actors can remember the choreography. When they all look the same, it's very hard for the actor to remember, okay, is this act one or is this act two? which sequence am I doing now? So they need to be distinct enough to fit the scene, and so that, for example, your actor playing D'Artagnan may have half a dozen or more fights over the course of an entire evening's worth of theater. You want to make sure that that actor is confident and clear in all of it. And I've been very lucky to have some delightful D'Artagnans in my experience. But both of those wound up having so many people on stage and so little space to do it in that finding ways to be really creative with the sword play and keeping the action moving in a way that is really interesting and engaging for the audience, while also keeping the actors out of each other's way and out of the audience's laps, it really requires some fancy footwork, literally, and planning in floor plans. Some of my choreography notes look like football plays because I have these X's and O's and arrows drawn all over the place. And it looks, again, like I said, like a football play or a conspiracy theory map if I were to put it all up on a whiteboard.
And then I imagine safety is a big concern as well.
Hugely. Like it's, as we can imagine in theater, it's incredibly detrimental to have an actor be injured mid-rehearsal or mid-performance. It's not something anybody wants in their workplace. And so we want these fights to have an element of danger for the characters, but we, the theatrical team and the audience, both want to know that at the end of the day, those actors are going to go home in the same intact state that they were when they started the evening. So a lot of the techniques that we use have safety and nonverbal communication built in to make sure that the actors are not being surprised by improvisation in the choreography, unless that is something that we have built in and there's a very clear frame around that improvisation. Some of the more modern kind of grapply struggles that you might see in, a modern drama. Some of those might have some vaguely organic improvisational elements in them, but they've been really worked into rehearsal so that we know that, between this move and this move, we're going to have this kind of contact improvisation jazz, esque movement that gets us from point A to point B, but the actors know what is acceptable in that improvisation during that time. Swordplay, that gets a lot harder because now we have extra props involved, and the tactile sense changes when you add the distance of 3 feet of steel between yourself and another person. 6 feet when you consider the other person's sword as well. Um, so those moves tend to be a lot more micromanaged and microblocked, and targeting is very specific. When are things happening truly online towards your scene partner, but safely out of distance, versus offline and off target, so that your scene partner is completely safe and will not be touched no matter how closely you move towards them. Near misses are a staple of a lot of fight choreography, and those near misses are very planned.
Mhm. And what about the audience? Is that something you have to worry about as well?
Absolutely. The stage space makes a difference on how I guess how frequently that concern has to come up in the choreography. A traditional large proscenium stage, think like the Benedum or the Byam downtown. You've got this big picture frame stage, and the audience is a good bit away from the action. So long as you're not sending props flying out and towards the audience, you're probably good for audience safety on that regard. The more up close they get, the more in the round the audience gets, the more you have to think about buffer zones of what do we need in terms of space to make sure that we don't have any stray swords going into anybody's laps or whatnot. And there's a lot of rehearsal time and blocking that goes into figuring out that spacing.
So it's a lot that you are juggling then in all of this. So.
Yep. There's there's a threat assessment meter that goes on from the time that I start reading a script, and it doesn't really turn off until the show closes.
So how did you get into this? How did you get trained for all of this?
Strangely, almost by accident. So when I was in college, I initially was pursuing a theater minor. So I only needed about 15 credits worth of classes to finish that little bit of my certificate. And mostly I was just doing that for fun. These were classes that I enjoyed. And I got into my last semester of my senior year of college, and I needed a movement class. And the movement class that normally fulfilled that was not being offered. It hadn't been offered for 2 years. It wasn't going to be offered for another year and a half. So I needed to get a special exception class to fill that, or I wasn't going to be able to finish out that certificate. And the only option was a stage combat class that semester. And so the department chair said, yeah, that'll count for your movement class. And I wound up just falling in love with the class. For me, it was a remarkable synthesis of all of the acting classes that I had been taking. Character motivations become so much more specific and clear when they are distilled down to put this pointy end into the other person. And hands down, the stage combat training that I have pursued since then has been some of the most specific and most rich acting training that I have received, and also some of the most detailed and specific and thoughtful directing training that I've received. So I feel like stage combat really does take a lot of the physical storytelling work that gets done, boils it down to very, very specific choices and demands for safety and for clarity of story, that everything be done very, very specifically. And I'm a person who really likes details and I like things to be specific. So that just locked in with my personality. So I enjoyed it so much that when I decided that, theater is what I actually want to do after all, and decided to go to grad school for it, I kind of made it my area of specialty and focus. And I've spent the past 15 plus years continuing my training with the Society of American Fight Directors across the country, and have spent a lot of hours devoting a lot of brain space and travel time to learning a lot of nuances about this very specific part of theater.
Great. I think we've talked about this in general. It might help people kind of put all the pieces together if maybe we talked about a specific scene or something and how you might approach it if you were in a play. And of course, one of Shakespeare's most famous sword fights is at the end of Hamlet, Hamlet and Laertes, where everybody's going to die, it seems like.
Sure.
And I
Yeah.
imagine you've done that scene probably a few times.
Yeah. Looking back over, as a fight choreographer, you might imagine Shakespeare is kind of my bread and butter. There are plenty of fights to be had in Shakespeare. Hamlet is a really popular choice. So in the past 15 years, I've done 7 full productions of Hamlet as a fight choreographer. I guess you could potentially count a 0.5 if you realize that back in my very, very first stage combat class that I was talking about, my final exam was to choreograph that final duel in Hamlet. So no one ever saw it outside of that class, but that choreography did get done. And no two of them have been alike. They've all been different. Lots of different stage spaces, lots of different actors in the roles, lots of different concepts, time periods, so on and so forth. So depending on when I'm brought into the process, I've already done a lot of time reading the script. I'm pretty familiar, but I need to know what the director has chosen to use for their script of the production. So what cut of the script are they using? Because it's of the ones that I've done, none of them yet so far has been the full uncut 4 hours that is the quarto and the folio combined, So taking a look at what the cut of this production is kind of lets me see which elements of story and the characters are really being brought to the forefront. Which of Hamlet's monologues are intact? What do we know about his character? How much of Laertes' character arc are we actually getting to see? How much of the setup with Osric in the scene right beforehand, where they talk about the wager, is there? Do we still have the joke about, what are his weapons? Rapier, or what is his weapon? Rapier and dagger. That's 2 of his weapons then. Is that joke still there? That tells me what the props for the scene ought to be. Is the director doing any kind of time shift for the production? Are we looking at kind of a traditional Renaissance-y style rapier and dagger or single rapier fight? Are we moving it back in time like the Mel Gibson version did to when historically this would kind of been set? So we're looking at, even older styles of swords. Are we looking a little bit more modern in history where we're thinking a little bit more Olympic style fencing gear? Um, those all kind of let me know a little bit about the the equipment that we need to plan for using and the style in which it'll be used. Having looked at the characters, it's always helpful to sit down with the director and with the actors and find out what the tone of this scene needs to be. Is it a grudge match from the start? Um, is there a big shift somewhere in the fight for the character of Hamlet? Does Hamlet buy into the fact that this is a friendly fencing match, or are there some suspicions about it? There are a lot of little interpretations and character choices that can be fully supported by the text of the script that could send the physical action in a lot of different ways, and getting on the same page with the rest of the creative team about what that needs to look like and how much does it spiral out of control by the end is really going to help define what the overall storytelling arc of the fight needs to be. And then once I know what the storytelling arc needs to be, I can start coming up with the movements that support that story.
So just to take a piece of that. So mention, is this a grudge match from the start, or does it start as a friendly fencing match that spirals out of control? So what are like some specific things you might do to support one direction or the other? I mean, how would those look different?
So from let's say we have the friendly fencing match that spirals out of control. We have all of Hamlet's text with Horatio before this scene starts, where he recognizes some of himself in Laertes and kind of, to paraphrase, feels really bad about how Laertes has been treated through this whole thing. And so we approach his handshake and essentially offer a fair play at the start of the deal as genuine. And so I've done some versions of this play where Hamlet's having fun at the beginning of this fencing match because he knows something that no one else knows, which is that he's been practicing when he was off at college. Like Claudius doesn't know this. Nobody knew this when the odds were laid on the wager. So it's fun for Hamlet to show off a little bit until he realizes that when he gets wounded by Laertes' rapier, that the rules aren't fair. They're supposed to be having a friendly match, and Laertes is fencing with a sharp rapier. It's bringing a sharp fencing sword to an Olympic fencing match. That's very much against the rules. So there's a tone shift, and we've learned throughout this play, Hamlet is very observant, and Hamlet doesn't take long to recognize when plots are being laid against him. So there can be a pretty immediate switch of this was fun and now it's deadly serious, all because of that one wound that happens.
So would there be different types of sword moves or techniques to get that tone across, or for each
A little bit. Some of it may be the choice of techniques. Some of it is also the choice in how those techniques are performed, the acting behind it. Yeah, I can take the same sequence of attacks and parries, and the actor playing it can make it a very tense, realistic battle for survival, or a very easy, you know, this is a fun game of physical chess that we're playing. Um, or one, or the characters are evenly matched, or one character is overpowering the other. The movements, the techniques themselves don't tell the story all on their own. There's a lot of the acting behind it that helps bring it all together. um, Obviously, the movements themselves are going to help tell the story of the martial logic. The choices of movements that a character makes are going to help show how savvy they are at this form of physical activity. A very poor fencer is going to show you that they make very illogical choices, or they just run on pure adrenaline and emotion and are very unpredictable. Whereas someone who has a lot more training is perhaps going to be somewhat less emotional until circumstances push them past their training. So there's a lot of little tiny moments of discovery that we can have in the rehearsal process that will come together to make the overall choreography a very collaborative piece. And again, hopefully makes it blend into the overall story of that scene. When that work doesn't happen, we have a lot of acting, 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 and then a pause, and then there's fight that happens, and then the acting starts all over again. And that I have seen examples of that, in my own early work. That I wouldn't want anyone to see that stage combat final that I did now, 15 years later, because there were plenty of moments of fight, 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 and now we act, and then the fight would continue. So I point the finger at myself as much as it anything that I've seen, when I make that comment. But yeah, the more all the pieces come together, the more rewarding it is for performers and audience, I think.
So you mentioned you've been doing this for a while, and you've been with Pittsburgh Shakespeare in the Parks for a while doing our fights. So, I mean, do you happen to know how many shows you've done fights for us?
Uh, Only because I looked it up before we had this conversation. Um, I have done uh, 16 productions with Pittsburgh Shakespeare in the Parks. Some of them as actor and choreographer. Sometimes I've had my foot in the assistant directing world as well. But usually, if there's violence in the show, even just a little bit, I've got my thumbprint in there somewhere.
So, what then are some of the unique conditions, problems that you run into in PSIP? Because you mentioned different performing arenas and styles present different issues. So,
Yeah, one of the things that I think makes PSIP one of the more challenging venues in which I have worked is just the fact that we relocate the performance to different park locations. I mentioned earlier about really wanting to micromanage those details of the fights. And one of the things that is the the tightrope to walk there is that the choreography needs to be consistent for the performers, which means that it needs to work in all of the different locations. And so in one location, we might have a park bench in the middle of the playing space that we cannot move. It is a permanent fixture in the park, so we have to work around it. In another park, we might have the part of the park we've chosen to perform in might be sloped more than the other parks. So I have to be mindful of, if someone needs to fall and roll, I want to make sure that I'm not sending them uphill instead of downhill when we get to that park. So how do we make that consistent across all of the parks? Um, I always do a scouting trip to each of the parks locations. I'm always there the first time the fights are done in any of these locations so that we can make adjustments that need to be made. But I usually try to design that choreography so that those adjustments are very, very small, very minor. And they will always get reviewed in a fight call before the performance. It's one of the things that we have built in for safety in fight choreography is before any show, the actors will review any fight choreography before the performance begins. So anyone who's come to a PSIP performance early to set their chairs up and get like a primo seating location and have seen the actors kind of marking through choreography, that's what it's for. It's for the actors' safety, a chance to make sure that they're all on the same page, on the same tempo, incorporating any adjustments that need to be made for that day. So the variety in terrain is one of the big challenges. The other is where the audience is in proximity. It's usually very close, which means that not only do I want to make sure that I build in that buffer zone of safety so that no one is having someone fall directly in their laps, but also some of the tricks that I might use in a big proscenium stage don't work as well when I've got people on all sides. There are things that some techniques that allow me to hide or mask the safety elements of distance or those carefully planned near misses because of angles. And when I have someone all the way around, I have fewer angles at which I can hide things. So it gets a lot more tricky. And fortunately, a lot of my mentors and colleagues in the field have been troubleshooting this kind of problem well ahead of me. And I have learned some new tricks from them that help deal with that in the round sense. And there's also the wisdom and experience of, well, let's pick something that works when the audience is all the way around instead of something that doesn't. So yeah, there's plenty to keep me on my toes in the parks.
Right. Well, any favorite moment from PSIP productions that comes to mind after
Oh man,
being productions?
let's see. Um, there's a story that our mutual friend Jeff Chips tells that I also find very delightful. Back when we were doing Romeo and Juliet, we started it off with this big crowd fight, and one of Jeff's children, very small at the time, was like, no fighting, no fighting. Just before Jeff had to make his entrance as the prince and say pretty much exactly no fighting, no fighting. There are kids at PSIP shows make the best stories. Not fight related. One year, I think we were doing the Tempest out at North Park on a day that Kayak Pittsburgh was also out at North Park, and we were right next to the pond, and a couple of kids had kayaked right up to the shore, right behind the scene, and were just engrossed by the action that was going on, and their mother was calling them from across the lake to come back. Without missing a beat, one of the kids in the kayak just shouted at the top of his lungs, "Mom, we're watching a show!" And it's just these moments of genuine response. One of my favorite fight related moments is actually from King Lear. Um, it was a challenge that we had presented to us in conceptually. King Lear is a remarkably bloody show. There's quite a lot of violence in King Lear, and some of it is unique to the show. Gloucester having his eyes removed on stage is uh, the one of those unique moments. It's very important to the plot. It has to happen. And the challenge is we're in a public park. People who are walking by who did not sign up to see this show did not sign up to see, the gore and violence of someone having their eyes removed. So part of the design collaboration was that instead of doing any kind of realistic blood effects for that show, we were going to do fabric blood effects. And just the audience buying into the storytelling of that moment so clearly that seeing this bit of stretchy red fabric extend from one actor's hand to the other actor's hand, and that fabric being tense and then release with a bit of a snap. um, just the collective shudder we got from the audience every time that scene happened. There was some brilliant acting being done by the actors involved in the scene that really helped the storytelling of that moment. But the fact that it was just such a moment of immersive storytelling with such abstract materials really kind of helped me believe in the magic of theater even more than I already did. Like that was maybe one of my favorite moments of manipulating an audience in a good way.
Well, hearing all that reminds me of, it's probably got to be one of my favorite moments of your work. Um, and also talking about manipulating an audience, and this was unintended. So it's when I was directing our production of Henry V, and we were doing those rehearsals of the fights
Mhm.
in the park so people could get the sense of the ground and all, as you were talking about earlier. And we were at a scene where Stony Richards was a English soldier, and he was capturing a French soldier, played by Sarah Carlton, who is a young woman, fairly small and slender, maybe half Stoney's size at most. And he was menacing her. So there's this fight, and she gets knocked down, and he's got a knife, and she's trying to crawl away from him. And as you are walking the actors through this and do this and that and tweaking that, of course, we're in the parks rehearsing, and I hear a voice off like on the pathway shouting, "Hey, leave that girl alone." And none of us really think about it because we're out in the parks. We rehearse, or we have to rehearse, as Tonya said, to get feel for the ground, and people watch. And we
And
thought,
also we're near the dog parks so much of the time. So hearing, "Hey, stop that," is 99% of the time it's someone talking to their dog.
yeah. And so Tonya had the actors keep going with the scene. I was busy watching the scene, and then we hear, "Hey, stop that," again. And we look to see this big guy charging in to rescue this girl who is being attacked by this guy in the park, and no one is doing anything. He was completely convinced it was a real fight, a real attack that was going on. And that was just a rehearsal. So that's a testament to Tonya's work, that an early rehearsal could convince somebody of that. And we stopped and were able to assure him, no, we're just working on a play, and showed him the the weapons and everything else. And then he was suitably embarrassed. And we said, no, don't be embarrassed. That means we're doing our job, that, you thought this was real. And
Mhm.
hopefully he came back to see the show when we put it up. Uh,
Yeah, I remember that moment very clearly. And yeah, not only was that a testament to the brilliant acting that Stoney and Sarah were doing, both of whom are just delightfully kind people, um, who were doing a really lovely job of committing to the truth of the scene, but also to the character of this passerby who was not going to stand aside and let something, that he perceived to be awful happen. Like, it was actually a really heartwarming moment of humanity for me too. I'm like, oh, there are good people in this city, and they will stand up when they see something that is unjust happening. So, like, I'm glad that guy stopped into rehearsal that day, even if he
Absolutely.
didn't intend to.
So we can't guarantee that you'll get a moment like that in a play. We don't know what you'll see when you come out. That's part of the fun of doing Shakespeare in the Parks, because as Tonya said, there are people there who didn't know they were coming to see a play, who may find themselves in the middle of it, and things happen. But we know you'll see some good moments. As Tonya said, Shakespeare has all sorts of physical stuff, whether it is just a push and a shove or a full-scale battle. And whatever it is, we hope Tonya will be with us choreographing those and rehearsing them for us for many shows to come. So, uh, Tonya, any sort of last thoughts or things you want to leave with people?
No, I will say that one of my favorite parts of when the show is finally up and running is sitting in the audience and watching the audience respond to it. Seeing how all of that time spent planning and rehearsing comes together when the audience finally is there to join us. That's part of what makes it all worth it in the end. So I'm really looking forward, after this past year of not being able to experience that in person, to eventually being able to have that experience for all of us all over again. So looking forward to seeing people out in the parks when we can be there again.
Absolutely. So hopefully this fall. So we will see people there. And also, I mean, Tonya choreographs for other companies as well. So, look for her name in programs, and check out her work wherever you happen to find it. So,
Yep. Have sword, will travel.
so thanks, Tonya. Thank you to our audience, and continue to enjoy all of our Week of Will events over the next few days.
All right.